Has the NBA gone soft? Are players sitting out games just because they can? How can they be missing so many games if they don't even play defense these days? What happened to playing 82 games like stars did in the 1990s? Hey everyone, NBA players have always missed games due to injury, but lately they've been missing more and more games due not only to injury, but also due to simple rest or load management. According to a recent NBA study that came out a few months ago, All-Star or All-NBA level players missed an average of 10.4 games per season in the 80s. Today in 2020s, top players are missing an average of 23.9 games. Now people spend hard-earned money to see their favorite players in person, and when that player randomly sits out, it's super frustrating. Everyone from Commissioner Adam Silver to Charles Barkley has taken a stand against load management. The issue has made a lot of headlines, especially after the player union's new collective bargaining agreement, which took effect in this 2023-24 season, stipulated that players must participate in at least 65 games to be eligible for seasonal awards like Most Valuable Player, Most Improved Player, All-NBA, and so on. This has put major pressure on stars to avoid sitting out games. And yes, there's certainly been less rest going on this season, but the 65 game is controversial. I think it'll lead to some major award snubs down the line, but that's not the reason I'm making this video. The actual reason is, I'm tired of this idea that NBA players are somehow lazy or weak or even non-dedicated enough to not play all 82 games in a season. We always hear about how past stars played all 82 games, and how they actually played defense while doing it. And I think that's an unfair way of looking at things. Now I'll preface this by saying I certainly don't like the idea of stars missing games when they don't need to. No one does. But I do have a problem with the idea that stars miss games because they're weak or even soft. The truth is, the game today is so much tougher to play than it was back then. Now that might sound funny if you've only ever heard arguments from old heads, or if you're an old head yourself. But I'm serious. NBA players today use a lot more energy than they did in 2003, or even 2013. Their bodies go through a lot more harsh movements. They move faster. It's simply misleading to only look at the games played stat line in the box score without considering this context. In this video, we're going to look at just how drastically the sport of basketball has evolved, and why comparing today's NBA players, health-wise, to the icons of the 90s and 2000s isn't just unfair, it's a completely different ballgame. As I said, basketball is very different from what it was in the 90s, when John Stockton or Michael Jordan barely ever missed a game. There's more emphasis on mobility than on strength today. Now let me explain. First, there's the obvious three-point explosion. Players today shoot a lot more threes, which means there's way more perimeter defense being played. It also means there's a lot more space to cover. If you're defending a three, you're naturally going to be running around the three-point line instead of hovering near the paint as defenders used to do. Unsurprisingly, all that court space means it's a lot harder to defend the perimeter than the paint. As a player on offense, it's easier to blow by your man on the three-point line than to engage him in the paint. This is why quick, explosive guards like Russell Westbrook in the 2010s and Ja Morant today are so valuable. Their athleticism lets them plow through defenses at the cost of putting major strain on their bodies, but more on that later. The rise of the three-point shot came about at the same time as the beginning of the pace and space era. As the name suggests, pace and space involves the use of smaller, faster lineups to outrun and outshoot the opposing team. Instead of playing a traditional big in the post, pace and space uses bigs who can shoot the ball from the three-point line. These players are called stretch bigs because their shooting ability forces defenses to stretch away from the paint, which creates a lot of room for guards or wings to score at the rim. Now there isn't just more shooting big men in the NBA today, there's just more shooters, period. Back in the 2002-2003 season, there were 91 players shooting better than 35% from three on at least one three-point attempt per game. But 20 years later, there were 209 players doing the same thing. That's more than twice the amount of decent shooters in the league. For that reason, it's not rare these days to see lineups featuring 4 or even 5 shooting threats. In the past, you could count on at least one non-shooter on a lineup, which allowed weaker defenders to rest on that player. And I'm not gonna lie, that still happens today, especially on weaker teams that don't have as many good shooters. But the good teams make sure to play as many shooters as possible. Look at the Boston Celtics this season, for example. And when you have to defend a lineup of decent shooters, you're moving a lot more. You can barely rest at all. Also, real quick, more players nowadays are simply good at more than one thing. Shooters like Duncan Robinson, for example, can drive to the rim as well as shoot the three. Guards like Josh Hart rebound about as well as an average center. And of course, big men like Nikola Jokic and Domantas Sabonis are elite playmakers as well as scoring threats. That's why the defense has to be in total physical and mental synchronization to have a chance against these talents. But back to the three-pointers. Shooting three-point shots also results in long rebounds, which makes it quicker for the offense to get back in transition. There are more fast break opportunities in today's game, and teams shoot earlier in the shot clock, on average, so as to make it harder for the defense to get set. Actually, players shoot faster, period. Specialized shooters like Buddy Hield or Klay Thompson have a shot release time of less than 0.8 seconds, based on a study from 2017. Fast forward 7 years later, and I'm sure there are a lot more shooters who are able to release the ball in less than a second. Now this all leads to more possessions per game, which in turn means a lot more time actively moving. All this means defenses are constantly twisting and turning their bodies at high speeds. Ankle, calf, and hamstring injuries are so common because in today's game, you need to be able to stop on a dime or switch to another man in an instant, and defense is only half the equation. The same things that make playing defense such a drag on the body today also make playing offense equally tough. As an offensive player, you're doing all sorts of unnatural movements. You explode to the rim like Ja Morant. You zigzag through traffic like Shai Gilgeous-Alexander. Even a move like the step-back three is hard on the body. James Harden, who popularized it, makes it look really easy. But the sheer force needed to decelerate like he does would absolutely shred a normal person's ankles. Players like Harden and SGA train super hard to strengthen their ankles for these moves, but even that doesn't prevent all injuries. Shai's been known to miss games due to his ankles, especially in past seasons. It's inevitable that he has to take some games off simply because of the way he plays. Speaking of hurt ankles, Steph Curry is known for missing many games managing his. Once again, the way he plays is a big reason for this. Curry is always on the move. During each possession, he's losing his defender and getting himself into a catch-and-shoot opportunity. You don't need to be a doctor to see how this playstyle does a number on a person's lower body, especially when doing this for 35 minutes a game, 60 times a year. That leads to my next point. The off-ball movement in today's game is more important than ever. On both offense and defense, every player is doing something at all times. And if they're not, they're a liability. The switching defense, the faster pace, the increased possessions, all this means players are accelerating and decelerating at wild speeds. Going back to Shai's example, his superhuman ability to stop on a dime and change direction instantly isn't just hard for him. His defender is going to have to slow down, stop, and speed up in an instant as well. Can you imagine the stress on Herb Jones' ankles as he defends Shai here? Of course, this doesn't mean that players will be spraining their ankles every game, but the wear and tear builds up over time, and it leads to those games where a player will sit out for rest even though they aren't officially injured. Now back in the day, meaning the 90s and 2000s, there was a lot more focus on isolation play. In clips from that era, you can see there's a lot of standing around on offense. There was much less ball movement, so players weren't moving at every second of their time on the court. This was before the three-point era, so you can see how the defense is covering way less space than in the modern league. Defenses back then could pack the paint and force mid-range shots, because there weren't as many good three-point shooters back then, and even less volume shooters. So defenses were safe leaving someone open on the perimeter. We always hear today about how much tougher the game was back then, seeing guys like Shaq or Charles Barkley or Patrick Ewing post up while getting hacked the way they did so often back then. Now players today can be just as physical, don't get it twisted. It's just that there isn't as much of a need to do that. For example, I saw this tweet a few days ago that does a good job explaining how spacing has changed over the years. You have Kobe Bryant during his MVP year in 2008, and Shai Gilgeous-Alexander today. The lack of space in 2008 is almost unbelievable nowadays. It's a completely different court than in 2024. Now it's not like the NBA doesn't realize any of this. Medical care these days is worlds above what it was in the 90s and even the 2000s. Teams invest millions of dollars in training staff, cryotherapy chambers, ultrasound machines, and other futuristic healing measures. The NBA itself has even taken steps like shortening the preseason and cutting back on back-to-back games in the schedule. All this modern medicine is a big reason why a casual fan would think NBA players are simply softer nowadays. But the fact that injuries are still happening, and in fact happening more often, despite the better care, to me proves that the game is simply harder on the body today. So what's the NBA doing about injuries and load management? Besides the team healthcare that I mentioned, that each team invests in, and the fewer back-to-backs, not much. In fact, the league's been going the opposite direction by discouraging players from missing games. They did this with the 65-game rule included in the union agreement, which took effect this season. Basically, if a player misses more than 17 games, they're disqualified from consideration for end-of-season awards, like MVP, Defensive Player of the Year, and the All-NBA teams. On paper, this seems like a great way to encourage players to play as many games as possible. But in practice, it's clear to me that it's had some nasty side effects. This season, players are indeed playing more, but now they play through injuries. For example, on January 30 this season, Joel Embiid got injured in a game against the Golden State Warriors. At this time, Embiid was leading the MVP race, but he'd missed a few games with knee pain. He was questionable for the game, but ultimately ended up playing. Throughout the game, you could see he was clearly less than 100%. And sure enough, with 4 minutes left in the fourth quarter, Warriors player Jonathan Kuminga landed on Embiid's knee, tearing Embiid's meniscus and pretty much ending his season. Now, reports after the game indicated that Embiid wanted to play simply because he was tired of the scrutiny around his missing games. But considering how much Embiid valued the MVP award, then I have a tough time believing that he wasn't also trying to play through his injury to avoid missing out on MVP consideration. Another example is Tyrese Haliburton. Haliburton lit the league up right when the season started, even leading the Pacers to the finals of the first in-season tournament. Before his injury, he was playing at an all-NBA level, averaging 24 points and 13 assists in his first 32 games. But he injured his hamstring on January 8, causing him to miss some games that month. He returned on January 19 for 1 game, and then missed the next 5 because his hamstring wasn't 100% yet. He returned again on January 30, on a minutes restriction, and since then he hasn't missed much time. But if you just watch some Pacers games, you can see he isn't 100% even now. If you look at Haliburton's stats before and after his injury, you can see how much damage his game has taken. It's super obvious he's playing through his hamstring pain so he can qualify for the 65 games threshold and hopefully get voted to an All-NBA team. Now, making an All-NBA team isn't just a nice title. It also means Haliburton gets an extra $53 million added to his max contract. With that kind of money on the line, I don't blame him for playing. He even said as much on a recent podcast with JJ Redick. But the depressing thing is, the way Haliburton's been playing, he might actually be hurting his All-NBA argument. His stats and overall game are hurting, and the Pacers are struggling too. So in his quest to make it to 65 games, to qualify for All-NBA contention, Haliburton's also removing himself from that conversation. And that's why I don't like the 65-game rule. There are financial incentives tied to the end-of-season awards, so it puts the players in a tough situation. Even if Tyrese does make the All-NBA team, the Pacers will still be less than 100%, and probably an easy playoff opponent. So in turn, the fans are also affected by less quality basketball. For this reason, I don't believe you can have financial incentives tied to the end-of-season awards while also having the 65-game threshold. Call me an enabler, but I think players should have more freedom to miss games when they do show signs of bodily injury. Now, at the same time, there's evidence that load management, or simply resting games to avoid injury, doesn't actually avoid injury, at least according to the NBA itself in that report I mentioned in the beginning of this video. This is why a great solution would be for the league to figure out a way to separate missed games that result from injury and missed games that are simply rest or load management. This would eliminate those random missed games that we as fans hate to see, but also leave room for actual injuries to heal. To be clear, I've heard the argument that availability is the best ability, and there's a lot of truth to that. Staying on the court is a sign of a player's dedication to their team and their commitment to staying healthy. As a matter of fact, managing their body is just another skill athletes need to master today. But as I keep saying, this isn't the same game as it was decades ago. It's a lot harder on the body. In this era, maintaining availability is harder than ever. We shouldn't expect players to play through pain. This just leads to more injuries and more missed games. As long as teams aren't shutting down players for vague rest, which doesn't work, they should be allowed to let them sit out to be safe. It's all about smart health management. As we've seen this season with Embiid and Halliburton, players are totally willing to play through pain if they have to. But just because they can doesn't mean they should. Kobe was known for his toughness, but he also played in a different era when sports medicine wasn't as developed as it is now. If his health had been better managed by proper monitoring and justified rest, we could have seen a few more years of high-level play from him. Again, availability is a good ability, but it doesn't mean being available for every single game. It means being available when needed over the long term. Like, what if Halliburton's hamstring becomes a chronic issue with him? It could affect his play for years. That could mean a lot more losses for the Pacers, which would prevent them from reaching their ceiling of a playoff team or even a contending team eventually. And all this just because of a few missed games in January. The physical demands and lightning-quick pace of the NBA today means that we, as fans, need to understand why players are missing so many games. The level of play means that advanced care and health considerations are necessary. Sure, a lot of those missed games are simple load management, but many others are due to legit injuries. Forcing players to play through these legit injuries, while also tying games played to money earned, is not the way to solve the problem. As a basketball enjoyer myself, I get disappointed when Zion, Williamson, or Paul George miss a game, but I get that sometimes it has to happen to prevent an injury from getting worse. Going back to the Kobe example, it's pretty well known how he lost at least a couple of years of high-level play due to his insistence on playing through injury. Now that's in itself respectable, but I would trade that for a few more years of Kobe in the league, playing at a high level. Today I fear someone like Embiid faces the same fate, which would rob both him and the fans of a great talent. At the end of the day, it's always more exciting to watch players and their teams compete at 100%, especially in the postseason. Strategic rest is the best way to keep up the level of high-quality basketball we've been seeing in recent years. Overall, the future of the NBA does look bright, with the potential for longer careers and quicker recoveries from injury. And as the game evolves, so should our understanding of what toll it takes on the athletes who play it. Thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. And leave a comment below on how you feel the NBA should handle the missed games problem. See you later.